It was supposed to be just another Friday night, but destiny had other plans. Ethan, a rugged single dad who spent his days fixing broken engines and greasy gears, only had one sacred routine: dinner with his 8-year-old daughter Sophie. She was his entire world, the spark in his tired eyes, the reason he kept going when life had chewed him up and spit him out. Every week, they walked into the same little diner on Oakwood Street. The neon sign flickered above, buzzing faintly like a heartbeat in the night. Inside, the air always smelled of pancakes drowning in syrup, and the waitress, who knew Sophie by name, never forgot to drop an extra cherry on her vanilla ice cream. For Ethan, this diner wasn't just a restaurant. It was safety. It was normal. It was home. But that night, something felt different the moment they stepped inside. The laughter seemed thinner. The hum of conversations was fragile, like it could shatter at any second. Ethan slid into the booth across from Sophie, trying to shake off the unease. She swung her feet under the table, innocent, humming to herself, completely unaware that a storm was about to break, because 3 tables away, danger was already brewing. A young woman sat alone, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her, 2 men loomed over the table, leaning in too close, their voices sharp and cutting through the diner's warmth like broken glass. Every word they spat dripped with threat. Every gesture screamed intimidation. Ethan noticed. His mechanic's hands froze on the menu, eyes narrowing, chest tightening. This wasn't his fight. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a man who changed tires and raised his little girl. But before he could turn away, a tiny voice pulled him back. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. Her eyes, wide and glistening, searched his face. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and innocence all at once. "Can we help her?" The question hit harder than any punch. Ethan felt his throat tighten, and in that moment, he realized normal was over. Tonight would change everything. It started with a sound that didn't belong. The diner on Oakwood Street was usually a cocoon of comfort. Forks clinking gently against plates, the soft hum of conversations, the faint crackle of bacon frying in the kitchen. It was the soundtrack of safety. But then, like a record scratched mid-song, a harsh, guttural voice cut through the warmth. "Come on, sweetheart, don't make this difficult." Ethan's head snapped up. At the far corner of the diner, a young woman sat alone, her back pressed against the vinyl booth as though she could melt into it. She clutched her purse to her chest like it was the only shield she had left. Towering over her were 2 men. One was broad and muscular, his neck thick as a tree trunk, tattoos creeping up his forearm. Rick. The other, Mason, was leaner but no less menacing, his sharp features twisted into a predatory grin. The woman's eyes darted wildly toward the exit. Every breath she took was short and panicked, her knuckles blanching white against the strap of her purse. She whispered something that Ethan couldn't hear, but the desperation in her trembling lips was enough. Rick slammed his hand down on the table. Plates rattled, coffee sloshed. The entire diner jolted in stunned silence. "I said you're not leaving until we're done talking," Rick barked. The woman flinched, shrinking deeper into the booth. Mason leaned in closer, his breath brushing her face. "You're smarter than this. Just sit back down and listen. You don't want to make enemies tonight." The waitress froze behind the counter, holding a coffee pot mid-air. An elderly couple whispered frantically to each other. A father with 2 teenage boys at the next booth instinctively pulled his sons closer. Fear spread across the room like wildfire. Ethan's hands clenched on the table. Beside him, Sophie stopped humming, her big brown eyes fixed on the scene with confusion and fear. Then, slowly, she turned to her father and tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried like thunder in Ethan's ears. "Daddy, can we help her?" Ethan's breath caught. His instincts screamed at him to stay put. He wasn't a fighter, wasn't trained for this. He was just a mechanic, a man who knew the insides of cars better than the darkness inside men. But then he looked at Sophie. Her tiny hand gripped his arm like he was the only superhero in the world. Her eyes glistened with trust, with hope, with something fragile that could shatter if he failed her now. He swallowed hard, No one else is moving, he thought. No one else is going to stand up. If I don't, what am I teaching her? His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. The sound echoed across the diner like a gunshot. Heads turned. Rick and Mason looked up, annoyance flickering into hostility. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs, but he forced his legs forward. 1 step, 2 steps. The diner floor seemed to stretch forever. Every eye locked on him as though he were walking a tightrope without a net. When he finally reached the table, he planted himself firmly between the woman and the 2 men. He could feel her trembling behind him, could hear the shallow quiver of her breath. "Is there a problem here?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. Rick sneered, his lips curling. "Yeah, the problem is you sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Ethan didn't flinch. He kept his stance tall, shoulders squared, body angled just enough to shield the woman. "She looks like she wants to be left alone. Why don't you two take the hint?" Mason chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Listen to this guy. What are you, her knight in shining armor? Do yourself a favor. Go back to your pancakes before you get hurt." The diner was dead silent now. Forks lay abandoned. Conversations had vanished. All that remained was the electric tension, so thick it was hard to breathe. Rick stepped forward, towering over Ethan, his fists clenched, the tattoos on his arm flexing like coiled snakes. "Walk away, old man. Last warning." Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears, but his voice came out calm, almost colder than he felt. "I'm not walking away. Not tonight." The words hung in the air like a dare. Behind him, the woman whispered, "Please." Whether it was a plea for him to leave or to stay, he couldn't tell. Rick's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed into slits. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he was about to swing. He braced himself, every nerve screaming that this was going to end badly. And then, something shifted. Rick glanced around the diner. Dozens of eyes stared back, waiting, watching, silent witnesses to whatever came next. He snarled, muttered something under his breath, then shoved Mason's shoulder. "Let's get out of here. Not worth it." Mason sneered, but followed. The 2 men storming toward the door. They slammed it behind them so hard the windows rattled. The diner exhaled as one. Conversations returned in whispers, like people waking from a bad dream. The woman sagged against the booth, her hands trembling as she tried to form words. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. "You don't know what could have happened." Ethan nodded once, his throat too tight to speak. He stepped aside so she could breathe again. From across the room, Sophie watched, her face glowing with pride. She clutched her napkin, marched to the woman, and gently placed it in her shaking hands. "It's okay," Sophie said softly, her small smile breaking through the tension. The woman stared at the child, then back at Ethan, and for a moment, tears welled in her eyes. Ethan returned to their booth. His hands were shaking, but he tried to hide it. Sophie slid in beside him, eyes wide. "Daddy," she whispered. "You were like a superhero." Ethan managed a small smile. "No, honey, I just did what was right." But deep down, he wondered if it was enough. He didn't know that this single choice, born in the heat of fear and courage, would ripple into a future he could never have imagined. Ethan's heart thundered inside his chest, every beat louder than the clatter of plates, louder than the whispers rippling through the diner. His hands, rough and scarred from years of twisting wrenches, trembled slightly against the table. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't built for this. He was just Ethan Cole, a single father, a mechanic, a man who knew the language of engines, not the violence of men. And yet, there it was. That voice, that whisper, the one that could cut through every fear he carried. "Daddy," Sophie murmured, tugging at his sleeve again. Her eyes, so pure, so full of hope, locked onto his. "Can we help her?" Ethan froze. He could have lied. He could have told her no, that it wasn't their problem, that someone else would step in. But as he stared at his little girl, he realized that if he stayed seated, if he did nothing, then he wasn't just abandoning the woman across the diner. He was abandoning Sophie's belief in him, and that was something he couldn't allow. His chair scraped back against the linoleum floor, shrieking like a warning siren. The entire diner seemed to stop breathing. Rick and Mason both turned at the sound, eyes narrowing, jaws tightening as they spotted him rising. Ethan inhaled sharply. His throat was dry, but his voice, when it came, was steady. He stepped forward, one stride, another. The ground beneath his boots felt heavier with each step, like gravity itself was testing his resolve. But with Sophie's gaze burning into his back, he pushed forward. At last, he reached the table. The young woman behind him whimpered, pressing herself further into the booth, eyes darting between her tormentors and her unlikely shield. Ethan planted himself in front of her, shoulders squared. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. Rick sneered, the veins in his neck pulsing. "Yeah, the problem is you, hero." Mason smirked, leaning back casually as if enjoying the show. "Walk away, old man. This isn't your fight." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew what it meant to stand his ground. He angled his body, making sure every inch of him was a barrier between the woman and the predators. "She is my business tonight," Ethan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It carried defiance. "Not tonight." The diner went silent. Forks clattered onto plates. A baby cried somewhere in the corner, quickly hushed by a frightened mother. Everyone watched, breathless. Rick's fist twitched at his side. His eyes burned like embers. He leaned forward until his breath was hot against Ethan's cheek. "You got no idea who you're messing with." Ethan's pulse pounded, but he didn't back down. "Then maybe you should explain it to the cops, because as far as I see, this woman doesn't want your company." The words were gasoline on fire. Rick's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding audibly. For a second, Ethan braced himself for the inevitable blow. He could almost feel the crack of bone, the sting of fists. Then Mason broke the tension with a cold chuckle. "This is pathetic. Some grease monkey trying to play knight in shining armor? You'll regret this. Man, people like us, we don't forget." Ethan didn't move. "Maybe, but tonight, you're done." Rick looked around. Dozens of eyes were fixed on him. Every patron in the diner was a witness now. If he swung, if he escalated, there would be consequences. He cursed under his breath, fury simmering in his veins. Finally, with a violent shove to the table, he snarled, "Come on, Mason, let's get out of this dump." They stormed toward the exit, Mason sneering over his shoulder as if promising this wasn't the end. The door slammed shut behind them, rattling the glass windows. Silence. For a moment, the diner stayed frozen in shock, as if no one dared believe it was over. Then the room exhaled. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. The waitress set the coffee pot down with shaking hands. Behind Ethan, the woman's voice trembled. "Thank you. You don't know what could have happened." Ethan didn't answer right away. His body was still tense, adrenaline buzzing like a live wire under his skin. Slowly, he turned, offering her a faint nod. And then, a small figure moved. Sophie slid out of the booth. She clutched her napkin, her face serious in a way no child should be. Walking across the room, she stood before the woman and held out the napkin with both hands. "It's okay," she whispered softly, a shy smile blooming. "You're safe now." The woman's lip trembled as she accepted it. Her eyes glistened, tears threatening to spill. She glanced at Ethan, then back at Sophie. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. Ethan returned to his booth, his legs heavy. Sophie climbed in beside him, her tiny body pressing against his side for reassurance. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hushed with awe. "You were like a superhero." Ethan exhaled, finally letting the adrenaline drain away. He managed a small smile. "No, honey, I just did what was right." But in the deepest corner of his mind, he wondered if this was really over, or if he had just opened a door neither of them could close. The morning after felt like a hangover of adrenaline. Ethan stood in his small repair shop, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag that had long since given up the fight against oil stains. The air smelled of gasoline and motor oil, his comfort zone, his kingdom. A cracked radio hummed an old country tune in the background, trying to remind him that life was back to normal. But it wasn't. He couldn't shake the images from last night, the slamming fist on the diner table, the woman's trembling eyes, Sophie's small voice begging him to help. He replayed it over and over, asking himself if he'd been foolish, if he'd put his daughter in danger. Yet beneath the doubt was something else: pride. For the first time in years, he'd felt like more than just a man surviving. Then, the sound of tires crunching against gravel shattered the moment. Ethan looked up. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop in front of his shop. So clean it looked alien against the backdrop of rusted pickup trucks and busted sedans waiting for repair. Its tinted windows reflected the pale morning sun like a mirror. Ethan frowned, tossing the rag aside. Nobody in his world drove a car like that. Not here. Not to him. The back door of the sedan opened, and she stepped out. The woman from the diner. But she wasn't the same fragile figure clutching her purse, shrinking into shadows. No, this woman moved with power. Her posture was unshakable, her heels clicking against the pavement like gunshots. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, every line sharp, precise, expensive. Her hair was styled, her face composed, her presence commanding. Ethan blinked, wiping his hands again as if grease could somehow clean away the disbelief. She walked toward him. Not timidly, not with fear, but with certainty. The kind of certainty only people who own the world seem to carry. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice smooth, confident, controlled. Ethan nodded slowly. "That's me. And you're—" She extended her hand. "Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Innovations." The name hit him like a punch. Hale Innovations, the company that owned half the factories in the state. The name plastered on skyscrapers, printed on contracts, whispered in business news Ethan never cared to read. He'd grown up hearing about them. Giants in steel, engines, and machines. People like her didn't come to places like this. People like her didn't speak to men like him. Yet here she was. Ethan hesitated before shaking her hand, his palm still rough with grease. I didn't know who you were." Victoria's lips curved faintly. Not quite a smile. "Last night, that didn't matter. And for that, I'm grateful." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, wiping his palms again on his coveralls. "I just did what anyone should have done." "No!" Her voice cut through the air. Firm. "Not anyone. Everyone else froze. You didn't—" She glanced around his modest shop, rusted tools, half-finished jobs, the smell of sweat and gasoline. Then her eyes returned to him, sharp and assessing. "Those men last night weren't strangers," she said quietly. "They were sent to intimidate me, to make me walk away from a deal that matters to a lot of people. But because of you, because you stood up, I walked away safe." Ethan frowned, his stomach knotting. "Who sent them?" Victoria shook her head, a shadow flickering across her face. "That's not important right now. What matters is this. You didn't just protect me. You showed your daughter what courage looks like. Do you know how rare that is?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words felt too small. Victoria turned toward the sedan. A driver in a dark suit retrieved a leather folder and handed it to her. She carried it back, setting it gently on the hood of Ethan's old pickup. He stared at it. "What's this?" "An opportunity," she said simply. Ethan flipped it open. Inside were neatly bound contracts, embossed with Hale Innovations logo. He skimmed the words, his breath catching as the meaning sank in. A contract to service and manage Hale Innovations' vehicle fleet. Trucks, vans, sedans, hundreds of them. Enough steady work to transform his struggling shop into something he'd only dreamed of. His throat tightened. "Why me?" Victoria's eyes softened. She glanced toward the open bay door, where Sophie stood in the sunlight, holding a toy wrench and humming to herself. "Because," Victoria said softly, "a man who listens when his daughter says, 'Can we help her?' That's the kind of man I trust." Ethan swallowed hard, his vision blurring for a moment. His hands trembled as he closed the folder. He had never asked for this. He had never expected anything more than scraping by, paycheck to paycheck. But now, because of one choice, one moment, his world tilted on its axis. Sophie came bounding over, her smile wide and innocent. She wrapped her arms around his waist. "Daddy, who is she?" Ethan looked down at his daughter, then back at Victoria Hale, who stood with the quiet power of someone who could change lives with a signature, and he realized their lives had already changed forever. The folder still sat on the hood of Ethan's dusty pickup, its polished leather looking out of place against chipped paint and rust. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off it. He could feel the weight of it, not just the paper inside, but what it represented. Victoria watched him closely. She could see the disbelief, the hesitation, the storm raging behind his eyes. For a man who spent his days repairing broken engines, this was a different kind of machinery altogether. The machinery of power. She drew in a breath, her tone shifting, sharper now. "Ethan, you need to understand something about last night. Those men, Rick and Mason, they weren't just random bullies. They were hired." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Hired? By who?" Victoria's eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something Ethan recognized: weariness, the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting battles no one else could see. "I can't give you all the names," she admitted, "but the truth is simple. There are people who don't want Hale Innovations moving forward with our newest contract. Billions are at stake. I was scheduled to meet a representative at the diner. Rick and Mason showed up first. Their job wasn't to kill me, at least, not yet. Their job was to scare me into backing down." Ethan's stomach tightened. Images of the night before replayed in his mind, the way Rick slammed his fist, the way Mason leaned in with that sinister grin. He clenched his jaw. "They wanted to make you run." "Yes," Victoria said, nodding. "And maybe it would have worked. Maybe I would have walked away from that deal, told myself it wasn't worth the danger. But then," she looked him dead in the eyes, "you stood up." Ethan shifted on his feet, uneasy. "I didn't do much. I just—" "No." She cut him off, her voice sharp with conviction. "You did everything. You didn't just protect me. You showed your daughter what courage looks like. Do you have any idea how powerful that is?" Sophie saw her father face down two dangerous men without flinching. She'll never forget it. The words hit Ethan harder than any punch Rick could have thrown. He glanced toward the doorway, where Sophie was crouched with her toy wrench, humming to herself. Oblivious to the gravity of the conversation, Victoria's voice softened. "That's what men like Rick and Mason will never understand. They think fear's power. But real power, true strength, is when a child can look at her father and see a hero." Ethan swallowed hard. His throat felt raw. "So what happens now? You just walk away from all this?" Victoria shook her head. "No, I don't walk away. And thanks to you, I don't have to. You gave me proof. Proof that even in a place where fear ruled the room, someone had the courage to stand. That's leverage. That's strength I can take into the boardroom." Her words carried the weight of someone used to commanding armies of suits, moving millions with a signature. Yet now, she spoke not as a CEO, but as a woman who'd been saved, whose armor had cracked long enough to show gratitude. "Ethan," she said softly, "you've already changed the course of my fight, and I want to change yours. You gave me safety. Let me give you a future." She gestured at the folder once more. "Take the contract. Build something bigger than you ever dreamed. Not just for you, but for Sophie." Ethan stood silent, his chest rising and falling heavily. He thought about his shop, his debts, the endless nights worrying about bills. He thought about Sophie's shoes wearing thin, about telling her no to simple things because money was always too tight. And then he thought about her face last night, the way she looked at him like he was larger than life. Maybe, just maybe, this was more than a job. Maybe this was destiny knocking on his garage door. He finally looked back at Victoria. "You really believe two men in a diner can change everything?" Victoria smiled faintly, the steel in her eyes returning. "I don't believe it, Ethan. I know it." The folder sat between them like a live wire. Ethan's calloused hands hesitated before touching it, as if the leather itself might burn him. He finally pulled it closer, flipped it open, and froze. Inside were pages stamped with the seal of Hale Innovations, each one carrying a weight far heavier than ink. Contracts, not just a job, not just a favor. A deal worth more than he could have ever imagined. The full responsibility of maintaining the entire fleet of Hale Innovations vehicles, trucks, sedans, vans, hundreds of them. His throat went dry. His mind spun with numbers, possibilities, the sheer impossibility of what he was holding. For a man who had spent years struggling to keep his tiny shop alive, this was nothing short of a miracle. He looked up at Victoria, disbelief flashing in his eyes. Why me? Why not a bigger company? Someone with more everything? Victoria didn't hesitate. She held his gaze, her voice steady and sharp. Because contracts aren't built only on skill, they're built on trust. And last night, when you stood between me and those men, you proved something no resume could ever show. You proved character. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to push the folder back and claim he wasn't worthy. But then Victoria's eyes flicked toward the doorway. Sophie was standing there, watching, clutching her toy wrench like it was Excalibur. Victoria's smile softened, because a man who listens when his daughter says, "Can we help her?" That's the kind of man I trust with everything, including my company's fleet. Ethan swallowed hard. The weight of her words heavier than any contract, his hands trembled as he closed the folder, clutching it to his chest. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a cruel trick. It felt real. And as Sophie ran to his side, wrapping her arms around him with that radiant smile, Ethan realized this wasn't just a gift. It was a second chance. Sophie ran into her father's arms, her tiny frame colliding with his chest as if she could anchor him to this new reality. Her laughter was light, her smile radiant. But for Ethan, it was more than joy. It was revelation. He clutched her close, his throat burning with the weight of it all. A single night, a single decision, one step across a diner floor had shattered the walls of his small, ordinary life and rebuilt it into something extraordinary. Looking down at Sophie's glowing face, Ethan finally understood. Courage isn't loud. It isn't born from power or money. It's the quiet choice to stand when everyone else sits. It's the decision to help when fear says walk away. That night at the diner didn't just save a woman, it reshaped a destiny. And in the end, Ethan realized kindness and courage never vanish. They multiply. One father's courage in a small diner changed his and his daughter's destiny forever. Stories like Ethan's prove kindness and bravery can reshape lives. If this tale moved you, hit like, share it with friends, and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire hope and strength every day.